All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Symbolism and Episcopal Worship. St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the land of the traditional land. I'm going to start over. St. Mark's, which I tell readers never to do, but I want this to be reverent. St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of all the Coast Salish tribes. Hannah's going to lead an opening reflection in a moment, but just to frame up our time together, I serve as a staff lead of 20s and 30s at St. Mark's, and one of the things that we've been working on this past year is having visioning dinners, and we have a great group of leaders who are just doing great things in our community and have wonderful ideas. And one of the ideas that came up out of the visioning process was to explore this question of symbols and colors and movements in liturgy. And as Rose and Hillary and David and Hannah and others got more into the conversation, we realized this probably isn't just a 20s and 30s conversation. And one of the things I've been so proud of about this group this year is really wrestling with when is something a 20s and 30s event, and when is it something that we can really just wrap everyone in and invite for imitation. So each of them have just displayed such leadership in putting this together. And so I'm really excited about the opportunity to learn from and with them tonight. So thank you for coming. And we hope this will be a continual conversation because we have lots of symbols and colors and numbers and liturgies to learn from.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to start out our evening with, I have a poem that I want to share, and then Lindsay's going to offer a little bit of sort of grounding and reflection for us. And just to give you a preview of where we're headed, the first part of it is going to be, we have some different people who are going to share some information, some reflection of their own experience. We have some conversation that we all want to have together here in the room. And then in the latter part of our time together, we will be able to move physically around and be able to touch and interact and engage with some of the physical objects that we often will see from afar, but might not know why we use them, what they are, when we use them, that sort of thing. So that's where we're headed this evening. But I want to share a poem with you all to get us started. And it's a poem by Mary Oliver, and it's called Making the House Ready for the Lord. Dear Lord, I have swept and I have washed, but still nothing is as shiny as it should be for you. Under the sink, for example, is an uproar of mice. It is the season of their many children. What shall I do? And under the eaves and through the walls, the squirrels have gnawed their ragged entrances. But it's the season when they need shelter. So what shall I do? And the raccoon limps into the kitchen and opens the cupboard while the dog snores. The cat hugs the pillow. What shall I do? Beautiful is the new snow falling in the yard and the fox who is staring boldly up the path to the door. And still I believe you will come, Lord. You will, when I speak to the fox, the sparrow, the lost dog, the shivering sea goose. Know that really I'm speaking to you whenever I say, as I do all morning and afternoon, come in, come in. So it's a little bit of a whimsical poem, right? But I think the invitation as we move forward in our evening is for us to see the gestures, the movements, the symbols, all of the many things that we're going to talk about tonight, not as things that we need to know exactly why and where and when we use them, but instead see them as things that invite us to ground ourselves into being present. We see them, we do them, we feel them. We might see someone do something that we don't do, and that's okay. These are all things that bring us into and invite us into finding the Spirit, finding God in whatever ways in which we gather. So I'm going to pass it off to Lindsay.
I'm not sure I really need to add anything to that, but yeah. Okay, so we're talking about symbols in worship today. When you get very familiar with the many symbols that we have in Episcopal worship, sometimes they can become so familiar that we just become desensitized to them in a way. They don't call attention to themselves, maybe in the way that they once did. So if that's you, I'm going to ask you this evening to put on your beginner's mind. All right. And imagine being brand new to the Episcopal Sunday liturgy. Perhaps imagine even being a newcomer to the Christian faith, right? If that's possible. When a newcomer steps inside a church on a Sunday morning, a church like St. Mark's, they will encounter all kinds of sights and sounds and ritualistic actions and moments that will very likely leave them wondering, what is going on here? They might make some assumptions. With any luck, they'll ask a few questions. When I first came to the church as an adult, and this won't surprise Michael in one bit, I think I completely exhausted the first few people that walked with me with all of my questions. Because for me, when I came into the church as an adult, it was like being a toddler all over again. It's like every Sunday was full of whys, right? Why are you doing this? Why are we reading that? Why are we standing up, sitting down, kneeling, crossing ourselves? What's that called? What's that for? Right? And I just, now I just think it would be tragic for anyone to feel daft asking 1,000 questions. I also think it might even be worse to assume that when you come into church, everybody else knows exactly what's going on except you. Because if there's one thing I can promise you, that is not true ever. I really enjoyed this sort of toddler time of having absolutely no idea what was going on around me. I was constantly surrounded by newness and mystery in it all. And this really woke me up, right? It woke up my mind. It opened my heart. It made me really sensitive, like hypersensitive to what the symbolism was attempting to communicate. I'd go every Sunday and just drink it all in, right? I felt really receptive. And the experience of that was fantastic. It was enlivening. So since then, I've made a real effort not to let myself get completely desensitized to everything that's going on around me, desensitized through familiarity. Not to let any understandings I'm acquiring along the way or knowings about what's going on, not to let that get in the way of the still unfully explainable bits. That's not a liturgical term, right? But the unfully explainable bits, which I think should always be a part of what we do in church together liturgically. So if you've ever spent any time around me, you'll have heard me say this before, but as human beings, we are interpreters. We make sense of the world around us. We take in all kinds of information and we turn it around in our minds and we make sense of it all. So knowing stuff is much more than just kind of learning a list of facts or answers to questions. It really is about experiencing, sensing, putting things together with some bits of knowledge to create some kind of understanding, right? Interpretation is not a once and done. It's ongoing and it's dynamic. In a life of faith, I really think that a life of interpretation is vital. So bearing this all in mind then, and back to the reason why we're here, what is the symbol? So a classic definition of a symbol is that it stands in for or represents something else. That's a standard definition of it. But it's a little bit more than that in our church context. I also want you to realize that language itself is symbolic, right? Language helps us communicate and share ideas, but it's still symbolic because on some levels, language may seem straightforward or obvious, object language, right? Laptop, head, right? It's pretty obvious, but some words that we use are very straightforward and clear, but other words aren't so easy. The word Jesus, for example, doesn't point to any one thing. Jesus as a word requires levels and layers of interpretation to extract a meaning. So all symbols are kind of like that. Some symbols are kind of straightforward, and other symbols are more complex and multi-layered. Some will have a simple surface meaning, others open themselves up to a variety of ways of extracting an understanding from them. I think we'll get to some of those, see some of those differences this evening. So even though there may not be one straight up interpretation for each of our symbols, don't worry, it's not the Wild West. Anything doesn't go here. We do have limits and boundaries. Tradition and church teaching and doing all of this interpretation together in community keeps us in the right landscape so that we don't drift off and wildly misinterpret something or attribute an inappropriate or unhelpful interpretation to a symbol. Symbols in church communicate in ways that words can't. So we can only ever speak or read one word at a time. But a symbol, some kind of object or a ritual movement or our vestments or a liturgical color can communicate a whole heap of stuff all at once, can radiate a depth of meaning just by existing. Symbols also are a very powerful reminder that there is much in life that holds equal or greater power than words. Symbols in church can be tricky, though. Their meaning is rarely entirely intuitive or obvious to a casual or uninitiated observer. So remember, put on your beginner's mind, right? You've walked into a high church, high Sunday morning, maybe it's evensong, right? There's incense, there's a full procession. You've never seen anything like it. And you're wondering, what is this? And you watch the thurifer swing the thurible at the head of the procession, and the place is filling up with smoke, and you're looking on and thinking to yourself, I see what's going on here. This is some kind of ancient crowd control. The fella at the front, right, is putting out some kind of gas that's keeping the crowd back from the holy people who are in the special costumes, right? Well, it's a possibility. So this thought experiment really does expose the dangers of literalism, or only kind of taking things as a surface, extracting from the surface what might be going on underneath. The strangeness of our symbols in church compared with the ordinariness of the world outside, I really do think helps us lean into the mysteries that our symbols each partially represent. In church, we can attune ourselves to the symbolism of worship, exploring and relishing layers of meaning and possibility. And then we can take that same attuned mindset back out into the world, more receptive to the depth of meaning and the truth of God in all things, especially the ordinary. So encountering symbols in church really does serve a richer and deeper purpose. Our liturgy that's full of symbolism invites us into another world. But that other world is also this world. And we're invited to see and experience it in a richer, more vibrant, maybe even a more real way. So surely experiencing such a multi-layered, poetic and aesthetic, meaningful liturgical experience, surely this is worth coming to church for.
Thanks, Lindsay. So before we get much further, we want to get a little bit of your voices into the room. So we'd love to gather here on the flip chart paper. And Emily is going to run around with the microphone. So the first question I have is, what is a symbol, a gesture, a movement that grounds you in your liturgical experience? As you think about coming to worship, coming to liturgy, what is something that grounds you, that helps you feel present in this place?
Bowing or, well, there's a couple things, and closing my eyes during prayer just so I'm not so distracted.
The altar and then the linens on it, or whatever they're called.
One thing I'll share for me, Scott Hewlett introduced me to this, but in hearing the land acknowledgement, when I hear it now at church, I really try to put my feet on the ground and have that sense of connection with the land, or I guess the ground, figuratively speaking, but it makes a difference for me. Others in the room or on Zoom, you can just raise your hand or pop off your video. There's got to be more for people. We wouldn't be Episcopalians.
Kneeling, both after receiving and also sometimes when you first come in.
For me, it's crossing myself with holy water as I enter the space. Just the sensation of the water on skin, in a way, wakes me up and it puts me right there.
For me, it's seeing the cross, and just sometimes I'll just stop and look at it and think about it. So yeah, seeing the cross.
I'm coming back to you.
Silence. For me, actually, it's coming in prior to the service when the choirs are rehearsing, and usually there's very few people in the nave, and I can just focus on just the music and not everything else that's happening at the same time during the service.
Sue Tate on Zoom. Can you unmute, Sue?
I think I did. To me, it's repeating.
Sorry. I love the fact that we get up and go to communion most of the time, rather than having it come to us, which seems much more passive than the decision to get up off my chair and walk up and say, I want this.
There was somebody else on Zoom that was going to share.
I like repeating the same prayers that my family has repeated for generations.
Number one, music in all its forms, however it shows up, and the peace.
I don't know if this is Episcopalian or not, but it definitely has been a St. Mark's influencer of turning toward the cross in the procession. And I find myself now, and when I go to other churches, I do that, even if I'm the only person who does it. It's just a muscle memory to be able to turn and follow, to your point of seeing the cross I also feel that movement in my body. Kathy.
I love seeing the gospel book, particularly the colorful one.
For me, I just like to take in the immensity of the cathedral space, just sitting there, and how we're all within this large area.
What do you think, Hannah? Do you want a few more, or are you?
Let's actually pivot to a different question really quick as we continue. These are wonderful. But another question, I wonder, what is a symbol, a gesture, a movement that doesn't speak to you or that you have questions about? Something that just sort of disconnects you because it's confusing, you have questions, it's not part of your sort of movement. What comes to mind? All answers are welcome. This is a safe space to share.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
It is to go through an entire service and not hear any music that I recognize. I've sung a lot of church music in choirs and in church, and I expect to recognize something. It's kind of my thing.
Well, I was thinking about when to do the sign of the cross, because I mean, I grew up Methodist where we never did it. And then I was in the Catholic Church where we only did it a couple of times. And we do it all the time in the Episcopal Church. And I'm never quite sure when I was supposed to do that.
We can ask James Davidson about his approach for how to remember that.
I think I'm finally getting that one, but the other one, what I don't really understand is what's closer to the mouth or something. I'm not quite sure.
During the gospel?
Yeah,
This?
so I don't really know what's behind that. If we're all supposed to do it.
Bill? Oh, sorry. Is your name Emily too?
No, it's Casey. This is a confession. It's passing the peace gives me anxiety.
Something had to say.
Something I've noticed at particularly Catholic parishes is the way people reverence the altar every time they step out of their seat or they step into an aisle. I've tried to do that here. For some reason, it just doesn't feel like a natural fit.
I just wanted to follow up on what you said, that COVID was the period of time for the pandemic was a great gift for my spouse, because the huggers retreated at passing the peace. And now he feels completely good nodding to people, and he doesn't have to kind of, so yes, you're not alone.
And I will say a previous version of myself was really uncomfortable with a common cup. And ironically, it wasn't until after COVID that I became comfortable with a common cup. So just naming that, which is a little bit odd. Others, what makes you curious or uncomfortable?
Passing the empty offering basket around.
That's your t-shirt line, Hillary. I'm an usher.
Anything else that comes to mind? This one? Well, who knows what we'll discover along the way this evening that belongs on one of these lists, but we can always come back to that conversation. Thanks for sharing those things. So we're going to take a few minutes now. Rose is going to share a few things, and Hillary is also going to share a few things. We got some questions in via the Google form that was in the description. And so we sort of crafted some of the sharing that we're going to do about gestures and symbols and colors around some of those questions that you all named. So thank you for those. But Rose, why don't you come to talk a little bit about gestures and symbols we might see?
Thanks, Hannah. I'm glad Lindsay made me feel better that we don't all know what we're doing, because I'm not a cradle Episcopalian, came from the Baptist church and still picking everything up, had to teach myself how to cross myself and all of that. So it's a fun experience, and I'll go over some of the things that we commonly see here at St. Mark's, whether it be gestures or symbols. I think one of the first things to go over is probably bowing. So there's three kind of different types of bowing. First is genuflecting, and I'll demonstrate, but bear with me because I'm somewhat new to some of this, but genuflecting. It's usually when there's a Eucharist on the table. So you'll see people when they sometimes come in and they go to their pew, or maybe they cross out of the pew. You'll see them genuflect as they're either going in or out. And usually it's during Eucharist when you have, sacrament or Eucharist on the altar table. You also, in some churches, not so much here, see the presider genuflect behind the altar. I went to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and they did that, where the whole altar party gets down and genuflects, and then they get back up again. Whereas we do more of a profound bow, where you bow at the waist. So that's another one of the bows, is the one at the waist. It's probably the most common bow you'll see us do. Another one is just kind of like the nod, like that. The most common time you'll probably see the nod bow is when Jesus' name is mentioned. More Anglo-Catholic would be anytime Jesus' name is mentioned, even at Mass or outside of service, you would do a kind of a slight bow. And you'll see some of the presiders here do that. Bishop Skelton does it a lot when Jesus' name is mentioned, just a very kind of slow, reverent kind of tilt, rather than the profound bow. The profound bow is most common when, let's see. Oh, and I also wanted to mention the reason behind bowing is you're averting your gaze before God. It's a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. So instead of looking directly at the presence of God, you're bowing down kind of in reverence. And the reason behind, I should say too, the more Catholic or Anglo-Catholic tradition of the kind of the slight bow for Jesus' name is Philippians 2:9-10, where every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess Jesus. So that's kind of where that methodology comes from. But kind of the main bow that we do is before the sacrament on the altar, receiving a blessing, bowing at the affirmation of the incarnation during the Nicene Creed. So when we talk about Christ becoming incarnate from the Virgin Mary, you'll sometimes see people bow and kind of keep bowing through that whole part. And then after the bowing, another kind of gesture you'll see people doing, and we do a lot of it, is standing. And we can kind of thank the Council of Nicaea for that. They believe that really standing is what we should be doing during prayer rather than kneeling. Kneeling in the Anglican tradition is typically for confession and petition. For the most part, we stand, and you'll see the presider oftentimes do, it's called the orans position, where you have your arms out like this. Steve, Lindsay, and Rich can tell me if I'm doing a very good job at that. So you don't see the congregation do it very often. The congregation can do it that way. You can all be in orans position. The most common though, and especially in contemporary Anglican kind of methodology, would be to just kind of have your hands here, kind of just standing, really being grounded, not shifting around. Especially for liturgical ministers, it's encouraged to just be very grounded, very kind of just steadfast on what you're doing. So let's see, outside of that, we have crossing, which I know is one of the most common questions. So I'll start with the gospel cross. I know that was one of the questions that we had. So when the gospel is proclaimed by the deacon, and I'm not the best at doing this, but you cross your forehead, cross your mouth or your chin, and then you cross your heart. The reason behind that is that you are praying that the gospel be imprinted on your mind, spoken on the lips, and loved with your heart. So that's the reason behind why you're crossing 3 different times. And then the full cross, when you're crossing your whole body like that, that is typically done, and there's a lot, so bear with me. When you dip your fingers into the blessed water upon entering the church, so when you come in and you have the font and you put your hand in the water and you're crossing yourself. When you're concluding a private prayer, before and after you've received communion, you can do it during worship. You can do it we typically do it during the opening acclamation, the end of the Gloria in Excelsis, also at the end of the Creed. When it's the part where we say blessed and the Benedictus es Domine, I think I got that right, Michael, which is at the end of the Sanctus. Also in the text of the Eucharistic prayer, and the blessing concluding the Eucharist, which I think we usually call the post-communion prayer. The easiest thing to do is probably to watch the presider, and you'll kind of always know when to do it. But those are the times where we typically do it. Personally, for me, I think not growing up with that and you see it referenced on TV and things, but when I started doing it, it meant a lot to me. I feel like I'm kind of sealing myself with Christ and the cross. So I'll sometimes do it other times that are significant to me. Sometimes I like to do it after receiving absolution. And I think with Episcopalians, we're not as rigid as some other traditions. So if something feels right to you, you don't have to have permission to do it. And then moving on to some of the symbols, one of the symbols you'll see when you first come into St. Mark's is the compass rose. The compass rose is the emblem of the Anglican Communion, and the points on the compass rose symbolize the worldwide spread of the apostolic and evangelical faith that we proclaim as Anglicans. And it's kind of based on the cross of St. George, which you'll see on the English flag, kind of the traditional cross like that, as opposed to St. Andrew's cross. But speaking of the St. Andrew's cross, if we talk about the Episcopal shield, so many times when you will come to the cathedral, we'll have the Episcopal flag flying outside. Also, if you look at the vergers on the chemiers, so the black vestment that they wear over the purple cassocks, you'll see in the bottom that there's an Episcopal shield on there as well. And then I know we also have our diocesan banner that has the Episcopal shield on it. So what that stands for is the red cross on the Episcopal shield is this cross of St. George, which is symbolizing the Church of England that we came from originally. It's kind of our heritage. Then in the upper left hand is the blue field, which has it's the Episcopal Church, and it has the cross of St. Andrew, Scotland. The reason behind that is because our first bishop, Samuel Seabury, went to Scotland and Aberdeen specifically to be ordained because we could no longer receive ordination through the Church of England without swearing allegiance to the King, and we didn't want to do that, obviously. So the Scottish were more autonomous, and they didn't require that. So Samuel Seabury was able to go up to Aberdeen and be ordained there. So we have, we pay tribute to that with St. Andrew's cross. Also, you'll see 9 crosses on the field of the Episcopal shield or the Episcopal flag. Those 9 crosses represent the 9 dioceses that formed the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in 1789. And then kind of moving on to the altar stack that you'll see in Sunday mornings when you come to worship. You'll see on the altar, it's veiled, so you can't see the chalice, and you see it kind of that triangle shape with the cross on the top of it. So with the stack, the chalice is where we hold the sacrament that becomes the precious blood of Christ. And then over the chalice is a purificator, which is used to basically wipe the chalice off during communion. The priest can also use it to cleanse their hands. Then we have the patent on top of that, which is where we put the bread, which becomes the body of Christ. Above that, we have the pall, which is kind of a cardboard piece that keeps out foreign objects from getting into the chalice and into the paten, so we keep things safe. And then we have a veil, which kind of hides the chalice and is supposed to represent the Holy of Holies. And when we take it off, it kind of represents the temple veil being torn in two. We have the burse, which is the square kind of sack that has a cross that's on the top. And then we have the corporal on top of that. And then at the very bottom is the linen, which is Latin for body, which represents the body of Christ. And then just real briefly, to make sure we answer the questions that we had, one person asked during the gospel procession, do you turn when it's the gospel book, or do you turn when the verger crosses you? So we're turning when the gospel kind of gets to us, as we're following the gospel out, and the gospel goes out into the people. With the procession, whether it's the opening or the closing procession, you're turning with the cross. And you'll also see people, and that's one other time you would bow, is bowing to the cross as it crosses. But that's all I have. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about color in the church year, and I have pictures because I think color is more fun to talk about with pictures. So if we can go to the next slide. There. So color serves a lot of things in our worship, but one of the main ways that we kind of see it is as that we can interact with it is signifying our place in the church year. So you can kind of look at the circle here to kind of orient yourself as the church year starting with Advent and then moving through, and you can see how each season has different colors that are associated with it that we can kind of use to orient ourselves, and each one of those colors has different meanings. And we see these colors in a bunch of different places at church. We see them in the vestments, we see them maybe most obviously in the altar, also the cross parament, which is like the cloth hanging from the cross. When we covered the icons and the covers that we used to do that. And we see that color has a really long history in the church. It really started to be used in this way as early as like the 4th century, but it was formalized in the 12th century in the Catholic Church by Pope Innocent III. So many, many centuries ago. In the Anglican Church, it kind of dropped out of use for a long time. But then in the 19th and 20th century, especially in the 20th century, the liturgical movement really brought vestments and color back into prominence and kind of into what we see today. So if we go to the next slide. One of the color that we associate with Advent is either blue or purple, depending on which church you're in. And we see that blue is a color that's traditionally associated with royalty. It's also associated with penance. And then blue we see is often associated with Mary, that it's the color of Mary. And I know you had more things you wanted to share about blue.
Sure, yeah. So just in regard to blue, we had a little mini conversation about, well, why blue somewhere and purple somewhere? If you have a history in the Roman Catholic Church, you're probably most familiar with purple being the use during the season of Advent. The blue in our tradition is often called Sarum blue, or it comes from the Sarum tradition. And Sarum is actually ancient Latin for Salisbury, which is a city and a cathedral in England. And if you know about the history of Christianity in England, it's pretty complicated. You know, the Romans brought it and then the Romans left. And so then Rome later, there was another mission sent from the Pope later, but there was already Christianity that had existed. So it's pretty complicated, right? But basically the Sarum rite was one form of the mass that was performed at Salisbury Cathedral. And that's where the blue originates. And so in many Anglican churches or Episcopal churches, they used blue to celebrate Advent, since it's more of an Anglican custom. So, and we use blue here, although you'll see there's also purple, like the Advent banners for O antiphons, and even the frontal does have some purple in it still. So.
And then the next color that you'll see quite often is white. So this is a picture of kind of, I think, the white that most of us are familiar with on the altar here at St. Mark's. We used it at Christmas and Easter, also for major feast days, marriages, and as well for funerals. White, symbolizes Christ's burial, garments, and the resurrection. It also more generally can be viewed by some people as symbolizing just joy and the brightness of the day. So it really kind of has these dual meanings, and that's why we see it used in kind of a lot of different settings. It's also often accompanied by gold, like ours is here, that we have the white with the gold as well. And then next up is purple on its own. And this is purple that we see during Lent. So this is what our altar looks like. And I zoomed out because I think that this is a really cool, this photo, you see not just the purple on the altar, but everyone's wearing the purple. And then you also have the icon that's covered in purple. So all of the different kind of uses of the color on the altar platform. And this color, we're associating purple with penance, with sacrifice, and then with preparation as well. So all of these different kind of Lenten themes are being represented by that purple color. And then green is the color that we use during Epiphany and during ordinary time, which we also call the time after Pentecost. And green is associated with growth and with life, and has all these really beautiful. I chose this one because I like how it's very ornate. But this really the season of growth and life and development. And then red is something that we don't see as much, but it has its place for sure. The main places we see it would be during Holy Week, Pentecost, and then during ordinations, which is not necessarily something you might, it's not something we're necessarily doing on Sundays. So that's why I wanted to include both of these photos. So you have red symbolizing blood and Christ's death, and then also fire and the Holy Spirit. So Pentecost and Holy Week. And you can see here this top photo, that's Holy Week. And then the bottom photo is how red is shown during ordinations. And then there's a couple of other colors that you see occasionally in the church here. So you see black during Good Friday and Holy Saturday, which indicates mourning, and then rose, which we don't use at St. Mark's, for one Sunday during Advent and one Sunday during Lent. And that symbolizes joy within preparation and gratitude. So this is a photo of Reverend Lizzie at the Jubilee Church in Austin, Texas, which is an Episcopal church plant. She's also one of the hosts of the And Also With You podcast, which I know a number of people at St. Mark's listen to. And I like this photo because these are her pink vestments. And I think it's well, they're just really bright and I really like that. But also, it's, I think, a kind of a different way than some of the colors and the designs that you might see at St. Mark's. So I wanted to include this to kind of show the breadth of what you might see both at St. Mark's and then also at other places in the Episcopal Church as well.
Why, thank you, Hillary. Let's give Hillary and Rose a round of applause. My turn, right? I'm just making sure I know who's going next. And so I don't know if we actually gave introductions, but I'm Michael Sewer, and I'm sure most of you know me from Sundays, usually in my cassock and surplice. I'm the sacristan and head verger here, and I'm gonna give you all a pop quiz. Are we ready? And people on Zoom, you're included as well. Actually, it's a pop quiz of things we haven't covered. So you're gonna cover for me the things I'm here to talk about, but I'm building a quiz in. So I want to talk about gestures and symbols and actions and things that change throughout the year. And we've actually already talked about quite a few of them. But first off, let's talk about the season of Lent, which we just got through a few weeks ago. The season of Lent is a season of repentance and fasting, and there are lots of things, gestures and symbols and signs and actions that change during Lent. Either on Zoom through the chat or in here, just shout out something if you can think of something that changes during that season. No alleluias. The gospel book changes, okay? The cross we use changes. Eucharistic prayer changes. Flowers, whether we have flowers or not, that's a change. The types of torches we use, candles. The size and types of candles we use. What else? Holy Week has its whole slew of changes. Each day almost has changes. One of them is the tradition of Maundy Thursday and the stripping of the altar. Yeah.
The confession and the service.
The confession. Mm-hmm. The change for the confession, we often begin the liturgy with what we call a penitential order. So we change the placement of the confession. The doors, someone said the doors. Anybody know what the church term is for the glass wall behind the altar. There's a church word, begins with an R, reredos. If anybody ever wants to play me in a game of liturgical Scrabble, I'm your man. Like, just my number and address is in church life. I actually used the word patent once in Scrabble, and I had to prove that it existed, and I was so proud of myself. So yeah, the reredos is the church word for the wall behind an altar. And our reredos at St. Mark's is unique because it actually has doors that open and close. And so another way we signify change of season, not just in Lent, but what other season do we close the doors? Advent, which is a season of expectation and waiting. What are some other things? What about our icons? What do we do with icons during Lent? We usually cover them. Not all of them. We have some in McCaw Chapel that we don't cover just for practicality, but we generally will veil icons. When you walk in the church, you might also notice that there's two objects on either side of the baptismal font, the Paschal candle and the chrism urn. Those we generally take away. Another few changes we make, if you ever attend the 8 a.m. service, our tradition here at St. Mark's is we'll generally use Rite 1. And Rite 1 is an older language version of our liturgy, which comes from the Elizabethan English. So these and thous, think that. And then another slew of changes, there's lots of them, are we generally will remove all brass or silver items, the precious metals, anything with gold. The one change we have implemented just post-COVID because of hygiene is we actually keep using the silver chalices. They're actually more hygienic than glass. And then we also will change some of our liturgical music. So the Gloria in Excelsis, I think Rose mentioned that, is a general song of praise used throughout the church year, except in Advent, except in Lent, we'll switch to either a Kyrie, which is Greek for Lord have mercy, Kyrie eleison, or during Advent, the Trisagion, which is just a threefold way of, oh wait, what is the Trisagion? My brain's gone blank. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy immortal one, have mercy on us. So these are a whole slew of different things you might see. That a lot of those are in Lent, but some of those we also use during Advent. Why do you think we do these liturgical changes? Who has a guess?
Tradition.
What was that on Zoom?
Tradition.
Tradition, that's a good answer. Yep, that's part of why. Phil? Thanks, Emily.
Not everything you mentioned, but some of them are celebratory, and we're supposed to be in a penitential state.
Yep, some are celebratory, some signify a penitence.
To make us pay attention.
Yes, make us pay attention. I'm not going to say any of these are wrong answers. One of the things you'll learn in the church is tradition means different things to different people. One person might bow for one reason, one person might bow for another. One church might tell you that you're bowing at the altar, one church might tell you you're bowing at the reserved sacrament. The whole point is these traditions, these symbols, signs, and gestures draw us in more deeply to our worship, to our understanding of God, and especially to the incarnational aspect of it. So those are some of the signs and symbols we've talked about during Lent, some of during Advent. We also, during Advent, has a whole slew of tradition. Think about your Advent wreath and the lighting of the candles. The closer you get to the birth of Christ, the more candles you light. And then we have a candle in the middle, which we call the Christ candle, which on Christmas actually is lit, signifying the one true light that comes in at the dark, and one of the reasons that Christmas was put, centuries ago on December 25th is that used to be the winter solstice. Of course, it's not anymore, but the whole point was Jesus was born on the darkest night of the year. The light of the world comes into the world. And then I wanted to briefly talk about, who knows where McCaw Chapel is? Of course, over here. Okay. So if you don't know where McCaw Chapel is, when you walk in the nave and you are at the baptismal font and you're looking at the altar and the reredos doors, the space behind the reredos is called McCaw Chapel. And I just wanted to briefly chat about some things in there that are meaningful to us and have symbolism. First off, on the left corner, or that's the south corner of it, we have a space where we keep reserved sacrament in what is called a tabernacle. Or an aumbry. Actually, there's a box inside of that tabernacle where the reserved sacrament is kept. And that reserved sacrament just represents the presence of Christ in the nave. And traditionally, the bishop will place reserved bread in the tabernacle at the Easter Vigil. And then above that, there's a candle that's lit, which represents the presence of Christ in the reserved sacrament. There also is in our corner, the other corner, there is a shrine that we call the Peace Shrine or Peace and Memorial Shrine. And that actually comes back. That's really a tradition unique to St. Mark's that comes back. I think Steve knows of this. I want to say it goes back to the 90s. There was a conflict somewhere in the war, and there was a decision to light a candle to represent peace at a time when there was international conflict. And that candle and that tradition has just been kept around at St. Mark's. It just represents our hope and prayer for peace in the world, which is a nice symbol as well. So that's a few comments about changes in signs. Hannah, am I turning it back to you now? Great. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much. We just get to take a deep breath now, because that was, so much information in 30 minutes. And we'd love to have a little bit of conversation before we move to actually like touching and learning about and interacting with all of the objects that we have to look at. And so I'd invite you at your table to turn and talk about this question. So liturgy, right? All of the things, the place where we find all of these gestures and symbols and movements, literally meaning the work of the people, right? The work of us together, is a communal experience. And so I wonder, as you think about all of these things, as you think about the things that ground you, the things that confuse you, what does liturgy mean for you? What is it for you? How does liturgy sort of speak to you and bring meaning for you in your relationship and in your journey in the world? Does that question make sense? How does liturgy speak to you? How does liturgy bring you into relationship with others, relationship with God, and feed your journey as you go forward? So talk about that a little bit amongst yourselves. All right, so I'm going to invite us to turn our attention back this way. Do we have anybody in breakout rooms, or did we lose people? Okay. Okay, great. Awesome. So we're waiting on our friends in Zoom to make their way through cyberspace back to us from their breakout room. And in just a moment, after we do just a little bit of share out, we're going to wrap up here. And then there's, as always at St. Mark's, there's like 18 different things happening simultaneously on the campus. So we brought the nave to us and have all sorts of things over here for us to go and play with and hang out with. So, but before we do that, what came up? What did you notice? Were there things that you found were sort of like resonating with everyone? Were there things that came up about the way in which liturgy grounds you that maybe you had never thought about or never articulated before? What came of the conversation that we might want to share with our whole group?
Going on Zoom to start? I'll share mine just briefly. I mean, the short story is I grew up Lutheran, and so liturgy was a strong part of my introduction into the church. And then I stepped away, and I didn't realize that I was so missing from my life. And even coming back into the Episcopal Church, I didn't realize that that was such a connection. And it's a longer story, but what I realized is that the liturgy and all of us in that service, it's a form of welcome and it's a form of connection. And I didn't see that in the same way when I first started coming into the Episcopal Church. And so all the ways in which we participate, whether you're in the pews or whether you're serving chalice or reading, like it's such a gift to one another that we bring. And even if there are no words interchanged, like we are in connection and communion with one another. And that to me is just so powerful because, I mean, can you imagine just being in the nave by yourself for worship every Sunday? That would be such a different experience. And it takes each of us bringing our presence and our preparation and our prayers. My 3 Ps I've gotten from Michael Seward, but it's a really beautiful thing that we get to offer each other in our presence of that space. What was it, Leah?
We ended up talking a lot about Holy Week and things we experienced during Holy Week. And I think the final thing that we were talking about was the vigil. And you know, this, I didn't really say it at the time, but I was thinking as you were talking, Emily, that so much of what our symbols and the experiences we go through walking through these symbols, especially during Holy Week, it really allows us to get away from words. I mean, we need words to communicate, but words are so limiting. And what the movement and the action and the symbols, at least for me, it can allow me to stop my monkey brain and get away from words and just be in it. And especially during so much that goes on symbolically during Holy Week, it's really possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for naming that.
Bill.
We talked about in a few different ways, both with the liturgy, with Sunday worship, and also like the elements of night prayer, evening prayer that I incorporate into the centering prayer times, that we're plugging into, that there are people all over the world and across the centuries who are doing this and have been doing this, and we're in some mystical way kind of plugging into that, and how welcoming and powerful that is.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Beautiful. Any other share outs from our conversations? I'll just share that I grew up Southern Baptist. Both my parents are Baptist ministers, and they put me in an Episcopal children's choir when I was in elementary school because my babysitter's child was going, and they were like, sure, just go along, right? You'll enjoy singing with them. And I was like, well, now many years later, I won't say how many, I'm like, well, this is kind of your fault. Like, here we are. And one of the things that I think even from that young age of being in elementary school that I love about liturgy and about the gestures and the symbols and the movements is that you don't have to know them all, and you get to just show up however you are, whatever you're bringing, however you're coming into that space, and it's just going to carry you. Right. And there's people beside you that are going to do stuff, and you can just be like, oh, okay, I'm going to stand up now and I'm going to sit down now. And so there's something about that sort of work of the people, right, as a whole, that just gets to hold us and carry us and invites us to lean in and lean out and be grounded in this place in ways that I think at least some of my experiences of other worship haven't done quite as much. And so I just offer that's my reflection on liturgy, but I think it's a beautiful way to really lean into much of, when we talked about all of these, this means this, and we do this at this, but, you know, circling back to what Lindsay said at the very beginning, like, it's an invitation, right, to enter in and to see symbols, to make movement and to pray and be present together. So thank you guys all for being here, for being on Zoom. We're gonna wrap up this portion of our time together and say farewell to our friends who joined us on Zoom.
One thing I just wanted to mention, a huge thank you to Sue Tate, who has put together a list of resources if you would like to read more, learn more, and we'll put those on the website. So thank you, Sue, for putting those together. And it's an ongoing conversation, right? So asking questions among one another, to Hannah, to Michael, to your fellow liturgical ministers, like this is not something that has to be just because you wear a collar, you know something or you don't. I would imagine that we're all learning things anew or a different dimension of it. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
To that point, I just really want to say thank you for having this conversation, because for me, I actually have found a lot of returning or becoming in my faith as it is now. I found it really difficult to not know a lot of things, and especially as a child, we did church in a very performative way. And I think a lot of the symbolism and a lot of the movement was a way to exclude. And so thank you for starting this conversation and opening it up as something that can be imperfect and should be considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that invitation, like, of just being people who ask questions, like, and we don't, each of us has different pieces of it. And so, yeah, anytime, like, being able to ask each other those questions is a beautiful thing. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we're going to say goodbye to our friends on Zoom. If you're here in the room, say bye, Zoom friends. And if you're here.